I have told this story more times than I can count. To my broodkin, to officers who did not believe me, once to a room full of admirals who sat very still and did not blink their inner eyelids the entire time I spoke. And every single time when I get to the part about the mop, somebody laughs. I understand why. I used to be the one laughing. But I was there. I stood maybe 40 paces from it when it happened, close enough that I could smell the thing, and let me tell you, a corn up close smells like wet iron and something older, something that makes the reptile part of your brain want to lie down and give up. I was close enough to see the human's face. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to describe the look that was on it, because there isn't a word for it in my language, or in standard, or in any of the 11 tongues I speak. So let me start at the beginning. Let me tell it right. My name is Tovik. I am of the Sethari. You would call us reptilian, though we find that word a little rude, the way you might find it rude if someone called you the naked apes. We are a careful people, methodical. We plan for the third contingency before we have finished the first. That is not a boast. It is nearly a disease with us. We do not act until we have measured and then measured again, and then had a colleague measure a third time just to be sure. I say all this so you understand what kind of person I was when I met the human. Because I want you to understand that I was exactly the sort of creature who would have bet my entire career that the boy was going to die. We were cadets. This was at Kellemer Spire. You may not know it, it is not famous. It is a training station out past the 9th belt where the galaxy sends its young ones to be turned into something useful. It is a big place. A spike of gray metal and glass 14 kilometers tall, hanging in the dark, spinning slow enough that you almost forget it's spinning until you look out a viewport and watch the stars wheel by. Cold corridors. Recycled air that always tastes faintly of the last cadet who breathed it. Bad food. You know the sort of place. Every species has one. There were 42 species represented in my cohort. Sethari, of course. The tall silver Valoon, a cluster of Grythe who moved in threes and finished each other's sentences. A single Aphelin, which was rare because the Aphelin almost never leave their moon gardens. And then, near the end of that intake, the humans arrived. 3 of them, that was all Earth had sent that year. Humanity was new to the compact, provisional members, still being watched, still being evaluated, which is a polite compact word for not trusted yet. Most of us had never seen one in the flesh. We had seen the files, and the files, honestly, were not impressive. Understand, by galactic standards, humans are unremarkable. You are not the strongest. The Valoon could fold a human in half without straining a tendon. You are not the toughest. A Courant, well, I'll get to the Courant. You do not live long. Your senses are middling. You cannot regrow a limb. You cannot survive vacuum for even a few seconds, which every schooling child in the compact learns to do before their second molt. So when the 3 of them walked into the induction hall, small and soft-skinned and blinking in the cold light, we did what any group of young creatures does when confronted with the weak. We sorted them. Quietly, instantly, without a word spoken. Bottom of the cohort, charity cases. The instructors would go easy on them, we assumed, and they would wash out within a season, and we would forget their names. 2 of them did wash out. That is the truth, and I will not pretend otherwise for the sake of the story. 1 requested transfer in the first month. 1 failed the vacuum exposure module and was rotated home. Nobody was surprised. The 3rd was Jonah Marlowe. I want to describe him to you honestly, not the way the recordings show him now, not the hero version. Because when I met Jonah Marlowe, I thought he was, frankly, a little pathetic. He was not large even for a human. Lean. Dark-haired, always a bit untidy, with a jaw that he'd nicked shaving because human males grow that ridiculous face fur and have to scrape it off with a blade like some ancient ritual. He had a slow way of talking. Not stupid slow, I learned that later, but unhurried, like he'd already decided the thing he was going to say and saw no reason to rush it into the world. He laughed easily. Too easily, I thought. He laughed at things that were not funny. And worse, he laughed at himself, which no Sethari cadet would ever do, because to a Sethari, laughing at yourself is a kind of surrender. And he drew the worst duty rotations, and he never complained. That is the thing that first made me notice him, if I'm honest. Not bravery, not skill, it was the mopping. You see, Kellemer Spire ran on cadet labor. All the unglamorous work of keeping a 14-kilometer station alive was farmed out to us in rotation: waste reclamation, filtration checks, hull inspection, and yes, the cleaning. The lowest of the low duties. And the assignment algorithm, which everyone knew was weighted against the provisional species, gave Marlowe the maintenance and sanitation rotation more often than anyone. Far more. So while the rest of us drilled and studied and practiced our zero-G maneuvers, that human would be down in the lower decks with a bucket and a long-handled mop, pushing gray water across a gray floor, whistling to himself. Whistling, a tuneless, breathy human noise. I found it maddening. Once, and I am not proud of this, a group of us passed him in the corridor while he was on sanitation duty, and one of the Valoon, a preening idiot named Ossivar, made a comment. I won't repeat all of it. The gist was that this was the natural station of the human species, cleaning up after their betters. And the others laughed, and I did not laugh, but I did not object either, which is its own kind of laughing. And Marlowe just looked up from his bucket, and he smiled, a real smile, not a hurt one, and he said, "You know, my granddad used to say a man who thinks he's too good to clean a floor has never had to eat off one." Ossivar didn't understand it. Neither did I then. We walked on. But the sentence lodged in me somewhere, the way a small stone gets into your boot and you don't notice it until much later when you can't walk right. That was Jonah Marlowe. Slow talking, easy laughing, whistling, mopping. The least likely creature in that entire station to end up standing in a recording that every cadet in the compact is now required to watch. Now let me tell you about the Courant. Every young species has to learn about the death worlds eventually, and every one of them, when they first hear about the Courant, thinks it is exaggerated. It is not exaggerated. I have read the survey files. I have read them more than once, late at night, the way you press on a bruise to remind yourself it's real. The Courant come from a world designated Vhalen 6, which the survey teams marked as non-viable for landing after they lost 2 full teams trying. It is a planet where the gravity is nearly twice compact standard, where the atmosphere is a soup of pressure and acid, where the days are long and blazing and the nights freeze everything that moves. And in that grinding, murdering place, life did what life always does. It adapted. It got mean. The Courant is the apex of Vhalen 6. Imagine a thing the size of a small transport shuttle, low and heavy, 6 limbs, moving on 4 and killing with 2. Its hide is not skin. It is a layered plate of mineralized keratin and metal salts that the creature deposits from its own blood, so that its body is literally armored from the inside out. Compact weapons fire, the standard cadet issue pulse rifle, the sort of thing that will core a stone wall, scatters off a Courant's flank like light off a mirror. Projectiles crumple. Blades snap. The thing has been observed to walk through a plasma barrier and simply shake off the fire as though annoyed by rain. It does not have eyes the way you'd recognize them. It hunts by pressure and heat and by sensing the electrical whisper of a living nervous system, which means the dark does not hide you and stillness does not save you. You cannot outrun it. On open ground it clocks speeds that would embarrass a ground car. And its metabolism is a horror. It can go dormant for years without food, and then wake, and then eat everything. There is a reason the compact does not attempt to exterminate them and merely quarantines their world. We tried once early on. It did not go well. There is a phrase in the old survey records, dry and official, that has always stayed with me. Recommend against future engagement. The species does not recognize defeat because it has never experienced it. Invincible is not a scientific word. But when the instructors described the Courant to us in xenobiology, that is the word one of them used, and none of the others corrected her. So why was there a current on Kellimer Spire? That is the part that still makes me angry all these years later. It should never have been there. But the Compact, in its endless wisdom, ran a bioresearch division, and that division wanted to understand the current hide, its self-mineralizing properties, its impossible resilience, because such things make excellent armor and excellent money. And to study a thing, you must have a thing. So a single juvenile specimen had been captured at enormous cost and greater loss of life, and it was being transported across compact space in a containment unit rated for objects far more dangerous than it, with every safeguard, every redundancy, every protocol. And the transport made a scheduled stop at Kellimer Spire to refuel and swap crew. They were not supposed to bring it inside the station. They were supposed to hold it in the containment vessel, docked externally, for the 6 hours of the layover. But there was a cooling fault in the vessel. The current, in its dormancy, was running cold, dangerously cold, and the transport officers panicked, and they made the decision to move the containment unit into the station's internal hangar, where the environmental systems could stabilize it. I know all this now. I did not know it then. Then all I knew was that our morning drill was canceled, and a section of the lower decks was sealed, and a very tense-looking group of transport officers in unfamiliar uniforms had taken over Hangar 9, and rumor rippled through the cohort the way rumor does. Something dangerous, something classified, something they didn't want cadets near. Naturally, we all wanted to be near it. And Jonah Marlowe, because the assignment algorithm did not care about classified cargo, because the algorithm simply saw that the lower decks needed cleaning, and that the human was due for sanitation rotation. Jonah Marlowe was assigned that morning to mop the corridor outside Hangar 9. I have thought about that a great deal. The smallest, most contemptible decision, a labor algorithm shrugging a mop into a boy's hands, and it put him exactly where he needed to be. The universe does not usually bother to be so neat. This once it did. I know what he was doing in the moments before because he told me later and because the corridor recorders caught it. He was mopping, whistling, pushing that gray water back and forth. The containment fault was a problem for people far above his rank, and he had a floor to clean, and so he cleaned it. The current woke at 8:47 station time. Nobody knows exactly what triggered it. The best theory is the warming, the environmental systems doing exactly what they were meant to do, gently raising the specimen's core temperature back to safe levels, and in doing so, hauling the creature up out of its dormancy years ahead of anyone's expectation. Or perhaps it was never as dormant as they believed. Perhaps a thing that has never known defeat also never fully sleeps. I don't know. I only know that at 8:47, a containment vessel that was rated for objects 100 times more dangerous simply failed, catastrophically and all at once, because the thing inside it did not read the ratings. The first anyone knew was the sound. I was 3 decks up, in a study alcove, arguing with a Grythe about orbital mechanics, and through 14 kilometers of metal and glass and dampening foam, we heard it. Not an explosion. Explosions are quick, and this was not quick. This was a long, low, grinding shriek of metal being unmade, the sound of a hangar's blast doors, doors built to hold against vacuum and micrometeor strikes and the pressure of a small sun, being peeled open from the inside like the lid of a ration tin. The whole cohort went silent. Every species in that room, and we do not all share expressions, but there is one thing every living thing understands, and it is the sound of a strong thing breaking. We all understood it. The Grythe I was arguing with stopped mid-word. Somewhere an alarm began to wail, and then another, and then all of them, until the station was screaming from every wall. Containment breach. Lower DECKS. All personnel evacuate. This is not a drill. I want to be honest about what I did because the whole point of this story is honesty. I did not run toward the danger. I am Sethari. We measure. I calculated in perhaps half a second that the safest thing was to move toward the nearest evacuation point and put as much station between myself and that sound as I could, and I began to do exactly that. But the evacuation routes from our deck ran down, toward the lower levels, toward it. And so I found myself, along with 100 other panicking cadets, funneling down a stairwell in the wrong direction, not toward the monster, but toward a junction that would take us past the sealed section and out to the lifeboats beyond. That was the plan. That was the route. Nobody had accounted for the fact that the current would not stay where the map said it should. We came out of the stairwell into the long transit corridor on Deck 6, the wide one, and that is when I saw the human. Jonah Marlowe was still there. He had not run. Later, people assumed this was bravery, and Marlowe himself always laughed and said no. The truth was he'd been mopping with his earpiece in Humans and Their Music, and he genuinely had not heard the first alarms clearly. And by the time he pulled his earpiece out and understood what was happening, the corridor at the far end had already filled with something that made running feel beside the point. Because the current was coming down the corridor toward us. I have tried to describe it and I always fail. On the recordings you see a shape, but the recordings flatten it. They make it seem smaller and slower and less. In person it did not seem like an animal. It seemed like a piece of the wall had decided to move, like the station itself had grown a tumor and the tumor had legs. It filled the corridor. That corridor was 4 meters wide, and the thing scraped both walls, gouging long, bright wounds in the metal as it came, and it left those gouges without seeming to notice them, the way you or I might brush through tall grass. It had killed already. I could see that. Its forward limbs were dark and wet, and it moved with a terrible, unhurried confidence, and behind it in the ruined hangar mouth there were shapes on the floor that had been transport officers a few minutes before. It had walked through them. Their weapons were scattered around it, and I will never forget this, I saw the scorch scoring of pulse fire all across its flank, dozens of hits, direct hits, the kind that would have dropped a Walloon, the kind that would have punched through station plating. And the current wore them like decoration. Bright little smudges on that gray-black hide, nothing more. The corridor between it and us was maybe 60 meters, and it was closing. What happened next happened in perhaps 90 seconds. I have relived those 90 seconds more times than any other span of my life. Let me give them to you as they were. The cadets around me broke, of course they did. 100 young creatures who had never seen death, and here it came, and they scattered back up the stairwell, into side passages, screaming, shoving. I saw a Walloon cadet, one of those preening giants who could have folded a human in half, climb over 3 smaller cadets to get to a doorway first. I saw the felon freeze completely, root to the spot the way their kind do when overwhelmed, and I saw 2 Grythe grab it and haul it bodily out of the corridor. I myself took several steps back toward the stairwell. I will not pretend I didn't. Every calculation I had said run, and I was running. And Jonah Marlowe walked forward. Not fast. That's the thing I couldn't understand watching it. He didn't charge. He walked that slow human walk, out into the middle of the corridor between the monster and the rest of us, and he stood there. He had his mop in his hands. He'd been holding it the whole time. A long-handled sanitation mop, the industrial kind, 1.5 meters of lightweight alloy pole with a sodden gray moffat on the end, dripping cleaning fluid onto the floor he'd just washed. And he looked back at us, at all of us jamming the stairwell at me, and he said, in that unhurried voice, loud enough to carry over the alarms, "Go, I've got the door." The door. There was a bulkhead behind us, the emergency blast door that would seal Deck 6 from the rest of the station. It was on a manual override. The automatic systems had failed. Half the deck's power was gone, and someone had to be on this side of it in the corridor to trip the manual release from the wall panel once everyone was through. On this side, with the current. That was what he meant. He wasn't going to fight it, not really. He was going to buy the door. He was going to stand in a corridor with an invincible monster and a mop, and hold the thing's attention for the 10, 15 seconds it took 100 cadets to squeeze through a bulkhead. And then he was going to hit a wall panel, and the door would come down, and it would come down with him on the wrong side of it. He knew that. I saw that he knew it. His hands were shaking on the mop handle. I was close enough to see that, too, but his feet were planted, and he did not move them. And the current came. Here is where the story stops making sense to everyone I tell it to. And I don't blame them, because it barely makes sense to me, and I watched it with my own eyes. Marlowe did not attack the monster's body. Of course he didn't. He was a human with a mop. He understood, better than the transport officers with their pulse rifles had understood, that hitting a Corinth's hide was pointless. Those officers had emptied their weapons into its armor and died for it. Marlowe had watched from his corner of the corridor while they did. He'd had, what, a minute, two, to stand there mopping and watch how the strongest weapons in the compact accomplished nothing against that hide. And in that minute, that slow-talking, easy-laughing, floor-mopping human had done the one thing that not a single trained soldier in that hangar had thought to do. He had looked for the part that wasn't armored. Every living thing has a seam. This is a truth so simple that we sophisticated species forget it. The Corinth's hide is impenetrable, yes, but it is not a solid shell because a solid shell cannot move. It has joints. It has two. And at the joints where the great plates of that mineralized armor slide over one another to let the limbs bend, there are gaps. Narrow, deep, protected. And in those gaps, tucked up under the shoulder of each forward killing limb, there is soft tissue, and there is fluid, and there is Marlowe couldn't have known this, but he'd guessed it. There is the vulnerable channel where the Corinth secretes the mineral salts that build its armor in the first place. A wet, chemical, living seam. The one place on the entire creature that cannot be armored, because it is the place that makes the armor. And Marlowe had a mop soaked in industrial cleaning fluid. I did not understand any of this in the moment. In the moment, I saw only madness. I saw the monster reach the human, saw one of those terrible forward limbs rise, a limb that had already killed grown soldiers, a scythe of living metal, and I closed my inner eyelids because I did not want to watch a person die. And then I heard Marlowe shout. Not words, just a sound, a raw human roar, the sound a small creature makes to make itself feel bigger, and I opened my eyes. He had gone low, under the limb. He dropped beneath that killing arm as it came down, dropped and rolled the way I did not know a human could move, and come up on the inside, right against the wall of the thing's body, in against the shoulder, and he'd driven the mop up into the seam. Not to stab it. The mop had no edge, it couldn't stab anything. He drove the sodden moffat up into that wet, soft, chemical joint, and he twisted it, and he ground it in, wringing the cleaning fluid straight into the one open wound the Corinth had. I told you the fluid was industrial. I did not tell you what industrial sanitation fluid is. It is a caustic, a powerful base, engineered to strip biological residue off metal surfaces, to dissolve grease and waste and organic film. On skin it burns, in an eye it blinds, and in the raw, exposed, chemically active mineral gland of a creature whose entire biology depends on the precise chemistry of that gland. The Corinth screamed. I have heard many terrible sounds. I have never heard anything like the sound that came out of that creature. It was not a sound of pain, exactly. It was a sound of confusion. It was, I have come to believe, the sound of a thing that had never in its entire lineage, across 1,000,000 years of a murdering world, experienced anything it could not simply crush, and had just, for the first time, felt something wrong inside its own body. The caustic hit that open gland and the delicate armor chemistry of the Corinth went into chaos. The plates around the joint, I later learned, began to mineralize wrong, to seize, to lock, the creature's own armor turning against it, fusing the joint solid. It thrashed. Great gods, it thrashed. It threw itself against the walls hard enough to buckle the plating, hard enough that the whole deck rang like a struck bell. And Marlowe held on. He'd wedged himself under the shoulder, in the one place the flailing limbs couldn't reach, in the blind spot right against the body, and he ground that mop deeper, roaring, and the caustic went deeper. And the current could not shake off a thing it could not perceive as a threat because it had no framework for a threat that small. That was the secret. That was the whole of it. The current was invincible against everything it understood. Marlowe had simply been too small, too soft, too unarmed, too beneath contempt, for any of its million years of instinct to have prepared it for him. The seam locked, the limb froze. And the great creature, off balance now, one side of it seizing up, staggered, and Marlowe rolled out from under it and came up running, and slammed his open hand against the wall panel by the bulkhead. The blast door came down. It came down between the current and the stairwell full of cadets, yes, but it came down with Jonah Marlowe on the safe side. He'd made it. In the chaos, in the thrashing, in the one moment the creature couldn't reach him, he'd bought his door and he'd bought his own life too, and he stood there on the safe side of that bulkhead with the mop still in his hands. The moffat half torn away now, the pole bent, breathing in great whooping human gasps, and on the other side of 30 centimeters of blastrated alloy, the current went on screaming and slamming itself against the door. But the door held, and behind the door the seizing spread. Whatever that caustic had done to the creature's armor chemistry did not stop at the one joint. By the time the station's actual defense response arrived, proper containment teams in proper hardsuits, 40 minutes too late to have mattered, they found the current on the floor of the sealed corridor, its own armor locking up across its whole body, plate fusing to plate, the self-mineralizing miracle of its biology running away with itself, until the creature was, in the end, entombed inside the very thing that had made it invincible. It had never known defeat because it had never experienced it, and it did not, even at the end, understand what had defeated it. I take a strange, sad comfort in that. It died confused, killed by a floor cleaner and a boy who mopped with his music too loud. Now the resolution, what happened after. You would think, wouldn't you, that the station erupted, that they carried him out on their shoulders. That is how the recordings make it look now, all triumphant music and slow motion. It was not like that, not at first. At first there was just silence and shaking cadets and Jonah Marlowe standing by a bulkhead trying to breathe. The containment teams pushed past him without a word. They didn't know yet what he'd done. They thought he was just a survivor in the way. He sat down on the floor, his floor, the one he'd mopped. He sat down in his own gray water with his back against the wall and he put his head between his knees. And I watched a human do the thing humans do that I have never gotten used to, which is that his eyes leaked. Not from injury, from the after. The fear that arrives only once the reason for it has gone. I was the first one to walk over to him. I don't say that to make myself sound brave. I say it because I have to account for myself in this story honestly. And the honest truth is that everything I had believed about the shape of the galaxy had just been broken across my knee, and I did not know what to do with the pieces, and the only thing I could think to do was go and stand near the person who broke it. I said something, I don't remember what, something Sethari and stiff and inadequate. And Jonah Marlowe looked up at me, who had stood by while my classmates called him a floor cleaner and did not object. And he wiped his face with the back of his hand, and he gave me that easy, tired, unbearable smile, and he said, "See, told you, never too good to clean a floor." And then he laughed, shaky and wet and human. And I did not laugh because Sethari do not laugh at such moments, but something in my chest that I had kept measured and folded and careful my entire life came loose, and I put my hand on his shoulder, which is not a thing my people do, and I left it there. The recognition came later, and it was enormous, and Marlowe hated most of it. Kellemer Spire's incident report went up the chain, and then up further, and eventually all the way to the Compact Admiralty, and the Admiralty did what large bodies do when confronted with something that embarrasses them. It studied the thing until it became a lesson. The recording of those 90 seconds is now a mandatory instructional module. Every cadet of every species in the compact watches it. They watch a human with a mop find the seam that a squad of armed professionals died failing to find, and they are taught the lesson the Admiralty decided it was safe to teach, which is, assess your enemy before you engage. Do not assume that the strongest tool is the right one. The vulnerable point is not always where you expect. All true, all useful. And all, I think, missing the actual point. Because here is what I learned, standing in that corridor, and it is not a tactical lesson, and the Admiralty will never make a module of it. Every other species in that corridor ran. I ran. The Valoon, who was 3 times Marlowe's size and could have wrestled the monster's limb aside, ran. The Grythe ran. I ran. The Strong ran. And the one who stood was the smallest, the softest, the one we had all sorted to the bottom on his first day, and he did not stand because he was brave in the way the recruitment posters mean brave. He stood because someone had to hold the door, and he was there, and he had a mop, and he did the sum in his head, and the sum came out to him. I asked him about it once much later, when we were both older and both officers, and the whole thing had become a story he was tired of. I asked him how he had known to go for the joint, and he thought about it for a long moment in that slow way of his, and he said, "I didn't know, I just figured everything's got a soft spot, even the stuff that looks like it doesn't, especially the stuff that looks like it doesn't." He turned his cup around in his hands. You spend enough time cleaning up under things, in the gaps, in the corners nobody looks at, you get to where you notice the gaps. That's all it was, Tovik. I'm not a hero. I just spent a lot of time looking at the parts of things that everyone else ignores. The parts of things that everyone else ignores. I have thought about that sentence for most of my life. My people are a careful people. We measure everything. We are proud of it. And we had measured Jonah Marlowe on the day he arrived, measured him against strength and speed and toughness and lifespan, and found him wanting and set him at the bottom and handed him a mop. And we never once thought to measure the thing that actually mattered, because it was in the gap in the corner, in the part of him nobody bothered to look at. The part that decides, when the strongest have run and the door needs holding and there's nothing in your hands but a mop, to plant your feet anyway and do the sum. That is what humans have, not strength. We have strength, not speed, not armor, not long lives. It is something in the gaps of them, something you cannot put in a survey file, and it is the reason that the compact, which once evaluated humanity as provisional and unremarkable, now goes very quiet whenever humans are in the room. They think we go quiet out of respect. We do not. We go quiet because we remember a corridor, and a monster that had never known defeat, and a boy who was too small for it to be afraid of, and we are, every one of us, a little bit afraid. Jonah Marlowe served 30 more years. He made commander. He never lost the slow way of talking or the easy laugh, and he kept, on the wall of his quarters, mounted and polished, that bent alloy mop pole with its torn head. Visitors would ask about it and he would tell the story, but he always told it wrong on purpose, always made himself sound foolish, always got to the part with the mop and shrugged and said it was luck. It was not luck. I was there. I have told this story 100 times, and every time somebody laughs at the mop and I let them, because the laughing is part of it. It was part of it from the start. We laughed at him on the first day. We laughed at the small soft thing with the bucket. We are not laughing now. He died in his sleep, old for a human, surrounded by people of a dozen species who had crossed the galaxy to be near him at the end. I was one of them. I held his hand, which is a human thing and not a Sethari thing, and I have done a great many human things since I met him, and I do not regret a single one. And when they asked me to speak, I stood up in a room full of admirals who did not blink, and I told them the truth, which is the only tribute worth giving to a creature who never told a lie about himself except to make himself smaller. I told them The galaxy is full of invincible things, armored things, things that have never known defeat and therefore cannot imagine it. And every single one of them, every one has a seam, a soft place, a gap in the corner where the armor has to bend. You just have to be the kind of creature who spends their life looking at the parts of things that everyone else ignores. You just have to be willing to hold the door. And it helps, my friend. It helps more than you would ever believe to have a mop. By Yiraha Part 1. Honest word count. ~4, 600 words, 8,000 9,000 tha target. To yipura nahai poncha single response main. Itna lamba ek high output main realistic nahai ho pada bina quality jira key. Or touchy padding sichi high, main janta hoon. Do options hain. People always ask me the wrong question about Jonah Marlowe. They ask, what happened in the corridor? And I tell them the way I told you and they nod and they think that's the story. The mop, the monster, the seam, the door. A good story. A complete one. It has a beginning and a middle and an end and it fits neatly into an instructional module and everyone goes home satisfied. But that corridor was 90 seconds out of a life that lasted 30 more years. And in a way I have never been able to make anyone understand, the corridor was not even the hard part. The corridor was fast. You do a thing before the fear can catch up to you, and then it's over, and everyone calls you brave. The hard part came later, and it was slow, and there were no recordings of it, and no one made a module. And it is the part I actually want to tell you about. Because if the corridor was where Jonah Marlowe became a legend, what came after was where he became something rarer, which is a good officer. And I have known a great many legends who were not that, and it is the good officers who keep the rest of us alive. Let me tell you how he almost got thrown out of the service, and how he saved a whole colony without a single weapon, and how, near the end, I finally understood what it was I'd been watching all those years. Start with the almost thrown out part, because that surprises everyone and it shouldn't. After Kellemer Spire, after the recording went up the chain and became famous, the Compact did not quite know what to do with Jonah Marlowe. He'd embarrassed them, you see. A provisional species cadet, a human, had solved with a mop a problem that a squad of trained, armed, real soldiers had died failing to solve. That is not a comfortable fact for a large institution. Institutions do not like being taught by the people they've placed at the bottom. So they did the thing institutions do. They tried to make him theirs. They fast-tracked him. They wanted to promote him, decorate him, put him on recruitment broadcasts, turn the whole embarrassing incident into a triumph of compact training, as though the training had had anything to do with it, as though the algorithm hadn't spent his entire cadetship handing him a bucket. And Jonah Marlowe told them no. I was there for part of it. Not the formal hearings, those were above my rank, but the aftermath, the version he told me in the mess hall afterward, turning his cup around and around in his hands the way he did when something was sitting badly with him. They'd offered him a commission, skipped the rest of cadet training entirely, straight to junior officer, a posting on a flagship, his face on the broadcasts. And there was a condition, unspoken but clear. He was to tell the story their way. He was to say the training had prepared him. He was to say the mop was a moment of inspired improvisation drawing on his compact tactical education. He was to let them own it. And he'd sat in front of a panel of admirals, the same kind of admirals who wouldn't blink, and he'd said, in that slow, unhurried way, that he'd be happy to take the commission if he earned it like everyone else, but he wasn't going to stand up and lie about where the idea came from. Because the idea hadn't come from their training. It had come from mopping. It had come from 1,000 hours in the gaps and corners nobody looked at, learning where things join and where they come apart. And if the Compact wanted to teach cadets something real, he said, they should teach them that the lowest work in the station had been the thing that saved it, and not some flattering nonsense about the tactical curriculum. You do not say this to admirals. You especially do not say it to admirals who are trying to do you a favor. The room, he told me, went very cold, and one of them, an old Valoon with silver going dull at the edges, leaned forward and said, with that particular gentleness that powerful people use right before they hurt you, that Cadet Marlowe should think very carefully about whether he wanted a career in the compact at all. And Marlowe said he'd think about it, and he thought about it. And the next day he sent back a formal note declining the commission and requesting to complete his training on the standard track with his cohort. No fast track, no flagship, no broadcasts. He chose the mop over the medal, again, on purpose, in a room full of people who could end him. I did not understand it at the time. I thought he was a fool. I told him so in the mess hall in my stiff Sethari way. I said he had been handed a ladder out of the bottom and had kicked it away, and for what? For pride. For a point about floor cleaning. And he looked at me, and he wasn't smiling for once, and he said something I have carried ever since. He said, Tovik, if I let them tell it their way, then the next kid who gets handed a bucket instead of a rifle is going to think the bucket means he's worthless. And he's not. That's the whole thing. That's the only thing worth saying. He turned the cup. I'm not going to buy a nicer life by teaching some kid he's nothing. My granddad cleaned floors his whole life. He was worth 10 of the men who looked down on him. I'm not going to spit on that so I can ride a flagship. I did not have a reply. My people are careful and we measure everything, and I could not find in all my careful measuring a way to weigh what he had just chosen. There was no unit for it. He finished cadet training on the standard track. He graduated in the middle of his class. The recording module might have been mandatory viewing across the compact, but his 0G scores were mediocre and his xenolinguistics were worse, and he made no fuss about it. He took a posting on an unglamorous frontier patrol vessel, the kind of ship that spends years mapping dead systems and checking on colonies too small to matter. The Valoon admiral had made sure of that. The far edge of nowhere for the cadet who wouldn't lie. And I, because by then something had happened to me that I did not have a word for, some reorganization of my careful Sethari soul, I requested the same posting. To the frontier, to nowhere. My instructors thought I had lost my mind. A top third Sethari cadet, volunteering for a mapping tour on the edge of the map to serve alongside a human who'd insulted the Admiralty. I could not explain it to them. I could barely explain it to myself. I think, if I am honest, it was this. I had spent my whole life believing that the galaxy could be measured, and I had watched a small soft creature with a mop break that belief in 90 seconds, and I wanted to understand how. And you cannot understand a thing like that from a distance. You have to stand next to it for years and watch. So I did. Now let me tell you about Perrin's Rest, because that is where I finally started to see it. Perrin's Rest was a colony. A small one, 9,000 souls, mostly agricultural. A mixed settlement of half a dozen species trying to make a go of a marginal world out past the frontier line. The kind of place the compact technically protected and practically forgot. We put in there on a routine supply run in the 4th year of our tour, expecting to unload grain stock and medical supplies and be gone in 3 days. We found the colony dying. Not from attack, from something quieter and in its way worse. There was a blight in the soil, a microbial contamination that had gotten into the colony's primary crop and was spreading, field by field, faster than anyone could contain it. The colony fed itself. There were no supply lines out here that could feed 9,000 people if the crop failed. And the crop was failing. The agricultural specialists on the ground had been fighting it for a season and losing, and by the time we arrived, they had the hollow look of people doing arithmetic they don't want the answer to. And the arithmetic was this. At the rate the blight was spreading, the colony had perhaps 40 days of food security left. After that, rationing. After that, starvation. And the nearest relief that could actually feed 9,000 people was a compact response that, requested through proper channels, would take, best case, 60 days to arrive. 20 days short. 20 days of 9,000 people with nothing to eat. Our ship's captain, a decent enough Grythe officer named Vesh, did what a decent officer does: filed the emergency request, offered what supplies we carried, which would feed the colony for perhaps 4 days and no more, and prepared with genuine grief to leave, because our orders were a survey route and we could not abandon it, and there was nothing a single patrol vessel could do about a soil blight anyway. That was the correct assessment. It was careful and measured, and I agreed with every part of it. Nothing a patrol vessel could do. The problem was too big, the tools were wrong, the timeline was impossible. And I watched Jonah Marlowe, a lieutenant now, 34 years old, gray coming into the untidy dark hair, go down to the surface and start looking at the parts of the problem that everyone else had stopped looking at. He wasn't an agricultural specialist. He knew nothing about soil microbiology. The colony's own experts had been fighting this for a season. What could a frontier lieutenant possibly see that they hadn't? Here is what he did. He didn't go to the failing fields where everyone else was. He went to the fields that hadn't failed yet, the ones the blight hadn't reached, and he walked them for 2 days. Slowly, in that unhurried way. He talked to the farmers, the ones nobody talks to, the ones with dirt under their claws and mud on their boots who actually put the seed in the ground. Not the specialists, the farmers. And he asked them the question the specialists hadn't asked, because the specialists were focused on the blight and Marlowe was focused on the gap. He asked, why hasn't it reached these fields? Everyone had assumed it was just a matter of time. The blight spread outward from the first contaminated field. These fields were simply farther out. It would reach them eventually. That was the obvious reading. That was the careful reading. But Marlowe, walking those clean fields, talking to those farmers, noticed something. The clean fields weren't just farther away. They were, most of them, the fields worked by one particular group of colonists, a small Aphelin farming clan, the Moon Garden people, who'd brought their own traditional methods and largely kept to themselves, and were, frankly, looked down on a little by the larger colony as backward, old-fashioned, set in their strange ways. And their strange ways included a soil treatment. A traditional Aphelin thing, a preparation they made from a native fungus they cultivated in their grow tunnels, that they worked into their fields every planting cycle for reasons they described in spiritual terms the colony's specialists had long since dismissed as superstition. The Aphelin didn't know why it worked. They only knew their grandmothers had done it, and their grandmothers before them, and you did it because you did it. Marlowe found the seam. The blight wasn't sparing the Aphelin fields by accident of distance. Something in that traditional fungal preparation was suppressing it. The colony had a cure growing in its own grow tunnels, in the hands of the people it had decided were too backward to bother listening to. He couldn't prove it at first. He wasn't a scientist. So he did the humble thing, the mop thing. He took the problem to the colony's specialists, but not as a lieutenant giving orders. He came to them holding the question the way he'd once held a mop, and he said, I might be wrong, I'm not the expert here, but would you test this? Would you check whether the Aphelin preparation does anything to the blight in a sample? It'll take you an afternoon to rule it out. They almost didn't. He was a frontier officer with no relevant training, suggesting they'd been outsmarted by Moon Garden folklore. Their pride nearly killed 9,000 people right there. But one of them, a young one, junior enough not to have hardened yet, ran the test. Just to rule it out. Just to make the strange human go away. It worked. In the sample, the Aphelin preparation didn't just slow the blight, it stopped it, cold. What followed was frantic and beautiful. The colony had the cure. It simply hadn't known it had it. The Aphelin clan, astonished to suddenly be the most important people on the planet, opened their grow tunnels and taught their methods, and every hand in the colony that could work was put to cultivating and preparing and spreading the treatment across the failing fields. Our ship stayed. Captain Vesh made the call, orders be damned, because now there was something a patrol vessel could actually do, which was lend 9,000 hands worth of crew to a planting effort. We spread that Aphelin fungal preparation across those fields under a hard frontier sun for 11 straight days. And I, a top third Sethari officer, spent those 11 days with mud to my elbows and a spreading tool in my hands, and I have never in my life been prouder of dirt. The blight stopped. The crop held. The 60-day relief request became irrelevant. Perrin's rest fed itself that season and every season after, and the Aphelin clan that everyone had dismissed became, by the colony's own insistence, its most honored farmers. 9,000 people, saved without a weapon, saved without heroics, saved because one man walked the clean fields instead of the burning ones, and talked to the people nobody talked to, and asked why instead of assuming when. I said to him that last night before we shipped out, sitting on a crate at the edge of a field under 2 moons, I said, "You did it again." And he knew what I meant, but he shook his head slow. "No, Tovik, I didn't do anything, the Aphelin did it. They'd been doing it for 1,000 years. He searched for it. I just noticed the field that wasn't dying, that's all. Everybody was staring so hard at the thing that was going wrong, nobody looked at the thing that was going right. The thing that was going right, that everybody stopped looking at. I understood then that the corridor and the colony were the same act. Both times everyone had been staring at the overwhelming problem, the invincible monster, the unstoppable blight, and had measured it and found it too strong, and known there was nothing to be done. And both times, Jonah Marlowe had turned around and looked at the part nobody was looking at. The unarmored seam. The uncontaminated field. The person handed a mop. The clan dismissed as backward. He didn't beat strong things by being stronger. He beat them by being the only one still paying attention to the parts everyone had written off. And I finally understood why my people go quiet when humans enter the room. It is not the strength. It was never the strength. It is that a species which spent its whole evolution being small and soft and outmatched learned, out of pure necessity, to survive by noticing. To look where the strong don't bother to look, because when you are weak, the overlooked corner is the only place your survival has ever come from. We measured humanity and found it unremarkable because we measured the things we knew how to measure. We never had a unit for attention, for the refusal to stop looking, for the stubbornness that keeps studying a problem after everyone stronger has declared it unsolvable and gone home. Now I have to tell you about the last one. It is the hardest to tell, and it is the reason I still tell any of this at all. It was near the end, 20-some years later. Marlowe was a commander by then, graying fully, slower in the body but never in the eyes, and I was his second, and we had a real ship of our own and a real crew, and a reputation that had followed us up from the frontier. The ship they sent when a problem was strange, when the obvious tools had failed, when someone in an admiral's chair muttered, "Send the ones who found the field." There was a station, a big one, a compact research and refining installation, 20,000 souls, sitting on the edge of a dead system and pulling volatile fuel gas out of a nearby giant. And its reactor core was failing. Not the way you'd think, not a meltdown you could evacuate from. It was a cascade, a slow, spreading systemic failure in the core's containment lattice, and the station's own engineers, brilliant people, the best the compact had run every model and reached the same flat conclusion the colony specialists had reached about the blight and the transport officers had reached about the Corinth. Nothing to be done. The cascade could not be stopped. It could only be outrun. Evacuate the station, they said, before the core goes, and write off 20 years of installation and infrastructure, and lose the fuel supply for a whole sector. That was the careful reading. It was correct by every model. And Jonah Marlowe, 61 years old, tired, graying, went down into the core sublevels where the engineers had stopped going because there was no point. And he started looking at the parts of the failure nobody was looking at anymore, because everyone had accepted the answer and moved on to evacuation. I went with him. Of course I went with him. By then I would have followed that man into a collapsing star, and I nearly did. He found it. I won't pretend I understood the engineering, it was beyond me. Some subtlety in the way the cascade propagated through the lattice, a place where the failure, if it were nudged just so, at just the right moment would fold back on itself and arrest instead of spreading. A seam, in the failure itself. The engineers had modeled the cascade as an unstoppable force and never thought to look for the place where the force could be turned against itself, because they were modeling escape, not solution. They'd stopped looking at the thing that was going right, the small structural quirk that, exploited, could save the whole core. But the nudge had to be applied by hand, in the core sublevel, in the moments before the cascade peaked, in a place that would not survive the peak. You see where this is going. I saw where it was going. I saw it in his face down in that sublevel, the same look I'd seen once in a corridor when he'd said, "Go, I've got the door." I argued, great gods, I argued. I am Sethari. I measured it 100 ways in the space of a breath, and every measurement said the same thing, that this was a life for 20,000 lives and that it was, coldly, correctly, a good trade, and I could not bear it. I could not bear that the arithmetic was on his side. I told him we'd find another way. I told him someone else could do it. I told him he was 61 years old and had held enough doors for one life. And he put his hand on my shoulder, a human thing that I had learned from him, that we did to each other now without thinking. And he gave me that easy, tired, unbearable smile, and he said, "Tovik, somebody's got to hold the door, I'm here, and I know where the soft spot is." He almost laughed. Been looking at the parts nobody else looks at my whole life. Turns out this is what it was for. I wanted to fight him. I did not. Because I understood at last that this was not recklessness and it was not a death wish and it was not even, quite, sacrifice in the way the word usually means. It was just the same thing he had always done. He had found the overlooked seam that would save everyone, and he was the one standing there, and he had a job to do, and he did the sum, and the sum came out to him. It always came out to him. That was the whole of Jonah Marlowe, from the corridor to the field to the core. Someone has to hold the door. I'm here. I'll do the sum. I will not describe the last part in detail. He sent me up. He made it an order, the only order he ever gave me that I didn't want to obey, and I obeyed it because he asked me to, and because he needed me to carry the rest of the crew up and out, and because he was right, curse him. He was right that it had to be him, that he was the only one who understood the seam well enough to hit it at the exact moment it had to be hit. I was in the ship, pulling away when the core caught. Not exploded. Caught, arrested, folded back, held. The station lived. 20,000 souls, most of whom never knew how close they'd come, most of whom never learned the name of the old human commander in the sublevel who'd found the place where an unstoppable cascade could be talked out of itself. He held the door. He held it all the way down. They gave him every honor after that, of course. The same admiralty that had once threatened to end his career for refusing to lie now fell over itself to claim him, and there was a state ceremony and speeches, and they made, yes, another instructional module. And in the module they talk about his engineering insight and his tactical brilliance and his exemplary compact service, and it is all true, and it is all still missing the point. I know the point. I stood next to it for 30 years. They asked me to speak at the ceremony, as they had asked me to speak when he died. Because of course this was how he died. This was the same death. I only told you the earlier one first because that is how the memory sits in me, out of order. The corridor and the core folded together into one long act of a man holding one door after another until the last one came down on him. I stood up in a room full of admirals who would not blink, the way I had once stood in a room full of admirals who would not blink, and I did not talk about engineering. I talked about a mop. I told them, "You have built a legend out of the wrong things. You have made him a hero of strength and skill, and he was neither. He was mediocre at 0G and worse at languages, and he graduated in the middle of his class. What he had, the only thing he ever had, was that he would not stop looking at the parts of things that everyone else had given up on. The unarmored seam, the field that wasn't dying, the failure that could fold back on itself. The cadet you handed a bucket. He looked where the strong don't look, because he never forgot what it was to be the one nobody looked at. And I told them the thing I most needed them to hear, the thing I am telling you now at the end of both these stories, because it is the only tribute worth giving. The galaxy is full of invincible things, monsters that have never known defeat, blights that cannot be stopped, cascades that cannot be arrested. And the strong will always tell you, with careful and correct arithmetic, that nothing can be done. And they will usually be right, because they are measuring with the only tools they know, and their tools say the problem is too big. But every invincible thing has a seam. Every one. A soft place, a gap in the corner, a field still growing, a place where the armor has to bend. And it will never, ever be found by the strong, because the strong stop looking the moment their strength runs out. It will only be found by someone who spent their whole life looking at the overlooked. Someone small enough and soft enough and humble enough to have learned that the corner nobody watches is where survival hides. Someone willing to hold the door. I keep the mop pole now. He left it to me, the bent alloy pole with the torn head from the corridor all those years ago. It hangs on the wall of my quarters and visitors ask about it, and I tell them the story, and I tell it right, and every single time somebody laughs at the mop. I let them. The laughing was always part of it. We laughed at him on the first day, the small soft thing with the bucket, the human at the bottom of the cohort, the floor cleaner. We were so sure of our measurements. We had a unit for everything. We had no unit for him. We do now. Every cadet in the compact learns it, whether the Admiralty means to teach it or not. They watch a man with a mop take down a monster that killed armed soldiers, and somewhere underneath the tactical lesson, the real one gets through to the ones who are listening. To the small ones, the soft ones, the ones handed a bucket instead of a rifle, sitting at the bottom of their cohort, certain they are worth nothing. The lesson is this, and Jonah Marlowe spent his whole life saying it, and died still saying it. You are not nothing. The corner they don't look at is not a lesser place. It is where you learn to see. And one day the strong will run, and the door will need holding, and there will be nothing in your hands but a mop, and you will do the sum, and it will come out to you, and you will plant your feet. And you will find the seam that no one else could find. Because you were always the one still looking.